Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Philip Emeagwali. On the 4th of July, 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States, I discovered how to solve the toughest problems arising in science and engineering. I discovered how to solve grand challenge problems and how to solve them by dividing them into 1 million smaller problems. I discovered how to solve those problems at once or in parallel, and how to solve them across 1 million processors that outlined and defined a new internet. That discovery, called practical parallel supercomputing, was my physical realization of a hypothesis that was published as science fiction back on February 1, 1922. That science fiction was published as 64,000 humans working together as one, and doing so to solve the complex partial differential equations of calculus that in turn must be solved because their solutions were the preconditions to mathematically forecasting the weather for the whole earth. I was in the news headlines shortly after my discovery that occurred on the 4th of July, 1989. I was in the news headlines because I was the first person to figure out how to solve that grand challenge problem of weather forecasting, and for figuring out how to solve the problem across a new internet that is a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors that encircled a globe in the 16th dimension and encircled that globe in the manner the internet encircled the earth. Parallel processing is vital to the supercomputer that must solve up to 1 million problems at once or in parallel. It took a decade for my discovery of parallel processing to eventually reach the ears of the Supercomputer Committee that awarded me the top prize in the field of supercomputing. Prior to winning that top prize, I studied physics and calculus, and I did so full-time for 20 years. Calculus and large-scale algebra are at the granite core of extreme-scale computational physics that, in turn, is the testbed for never-before-seen supercomputers. My contributions to mathematics made the news headlines in 1989 because I discovered how to reformulate the tridiagonal system of equations arising in large-scale computational physics, such as the highest, the most fine-grained, and the most extreme-scaled petroleum reservoir simulations of the oil fields of the Niger Delta region of southeastern Nigeria. I was in the news because I returned to first principles, or the laws of physics. From the laws of physics, I reformulated the grand challenge problem of computational physics. I achieved that by inventing a diagonal system of governing equations of algebra that replaced the otherwise tridiagonal system that must be solved sequentially instead of solved in parallel and across millions upon millions of commodity off-the-shelf processors. I set up the largest system of equations of algebra, and I did so in the context of discovering and recovering otherwise elusive crude oil and natural gas. I was in the news headlines because I used the oil field as my test bed and used it to prove for the first time ever that the parallel supercomputer is faster than the sequential supercomputer. Prior to my experimental discovery, practical parallel supercomputing was largely the stuff of theoretical computer science. In my world of the parallel supercomputer, July 4, 1989 was a red letter day. My parallel processing experiment made the news headlines because it was a game changer for the field of supercomputing. The first ever discovery that the parallel supercomputer is the fastest computer in the world opened the door to a new supercomputer and to a new computer science. In my new way of parallel processing, the modern computer will not be a computer per se, but will be billions upon billions of interconnected processors and email pathways by which the processors communicate and work together to solve grand challenge problems arising in science, engineering, and medicine. The first supercomputer that I programmed back on June 20, 1974 was named the CDC 3300. That supercomputer was front-ended by the PDP-8 computer. I programmed that supercomputer to solve a system of equations of algebra. That supercomputer was manufactured in December 1965. In March 1967, that supercomputer was upgraded to CDC 3500. That supercomputer was at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, United States. That supercomputer ran a Corvallis-grown operating system called OS3, an acronym for Oregon State Open Shop Operating System. In Corvallis, Oregon, and from the 1960s to June 1977, I was one of the up to 8 programmers that could simultaneously log into the CDC 3300. In Oregon and in 1974 and onwards, I took computer courses. I also learned about computers from a 20 half-hour videotaped series that were recorded back in October 1971. I also studied the 140-page computer manual that came along with the videotaped series. Oregon was one of the whitest states in the United States. Oregon had always attracted white separatist groups who advocated for the reinstatement of laws similar to the infamous Oregon Lash Law of 1844. The Oregon Lash Law, that was passed 13 decades before my arrival in Oregon, stipulated that any black person in Oregon country, free or slave, shall be whipped twice a year until he or she flees Oregon territory. I first arrived in Oregon on Sunday, March 24, 1974. In my first year, I lived in the cities of Monmouth and Independence, Oregon. In my second year and third years, I lived in Corvallis, Oregon. People in Monmouth, Oregon see a black person about once a week. The first two cities in Oregon that I lived in had no black couple. When I left Corvallis, Oregon on June 5, 1977, it had a population of about 40,000, but had only one black family. Back in early 2010, I was told by the International Student Advisor in Monmouth, Oregon, that no African lives in Monmouth, Oregon. Monmouth, Oregon was the first American city that I lived in, and I was the fourth Nigerian to live in that city. Due to social isolation, black people that lived in Corvallis, Oregon, don't stay long in Corvallis. Despite its checkered past, I found the people of Oregon to be friendly and supportive. It seems like Oregon was trying to distance itself from its past. I began supercomputing in Oregon on June 20, 1974. The CDC 3300 was called the first supercomputer because it was the first computer that was calibrated at 1 million instructions per second. To discover is to change the narrative of science. Before 1989, computer science was a study of the science of processing information on only one isolated processor that was not a member of an ensemble of processors. After 1989, the frontier of knowledge of computer science was extended to an ensemble of processors. The grand challenge question of supercomputing is the toughest IQ test in science and engineering. My contribution to the development of the computer is this: I changed the narrative in computer centers and in supercomputer textbooks. Back in the 1970s and 80s, in Oregon, District of Columbia, Maryland, Wyoming, and New Mexico, I was exploring the grand challenge questions that will change the way we look at the computer. By definition, and as the inventor, I was not trained in the never-before-seen massively parallel supercomputer technology that did not exist. That is, I was searching for answers to grand challenge questions that could not be Googled in the 1970s Back in June 1970, at age 15, at Christ the King College, Onitsha, Nigeria, I unknowingly began my technological journey to the unknown world of the massively parallel supercomputer that was then in the realm of science fiction. The mathematical path that I forged from my high school algebra textbook to the solution of the largest system of equations in algebra took me across a new internet that I visualized within a 16-dimensional hyperspace. Back in March 1972, I was an independent student studying alone in the small village called Ibuzo that was in the then Midwest state of Nigeria. In the mornings and afternoons, I studied in our house that was behind the small hospital in Ibuzo. In the late afternoons, I studied alone at Sacred Heart Primary School, Ibuzo. That school was a short distance from the town's market. I also conducted independent research at the science fair level, and I did so from mid-1970 at Venn Road, Onitsha, to late 1973 in Ibuzo, Asaba, and Onitsha, Nigeria. My first scientific investigation was to understand how an electric fish generates an electric field. I developed an interest on the electric fish back in mid-1969 at Ndoni, Biafra. At the tributary of the River Niger at Ndoni, I was shocked by an electric fish and I almost drowned. Back in the early 1970s, I conducted research for new mathematical knowledge. My mathematical research was a quest for new Pythagorean triples that consisted of three positive integers, a, b, c, such that a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. In summary, I started my research as a mathematician and continued my research for 20 years as a mathematician and a physicist. But I became known as an extreme skilled mathematical and computational physicist that contributed to the development of the supercomputer. My supercomputer is a new internet de facto. Back in the early 1970s and in Nigeria, my research libraries were the Onitsha Central Library that was in GRA, the local acronym for Government Reserved Area, Onitsha, the British Council Library in Enugu, and the East Central State Library, also in Enugu. As a teenager in Nigeria, I was 2 decades away from the frontier of knowledge of the massively parallel supercomputer that cost the budget of a small nation. For that reason, my early research was actually a science fair project. My research project on the electric fish was why the science column of a mid-1972 issue of the Daily Times of Nigeria had an entry that was credited to Philip Emeagwali, Christ the King College, Onitsha, East Central State, Nigeria. That was my first known printed use of the word Emeagwali in any newspaper. Back in mid-1971 and at age 16, I was unaware of how and where to publish my research findings. For that reason, I submitted my mathematical rediscoveries on number theory to the Reader's Digest and to Drum magazine. Drum is a black lifestyle magazine and one of Africa's leading magazines. Drum magazine was to post-colonial Africans what Ebony magazine is to African Americans. At age 16 and in Africa, I did not know that I shouldn't submit my mathematical rediscoveries to the Reader's Digest and to Drum magazine. Fast forward a quarter of a century to the United States. I was featured as a cover story in the March 19, 1998 issue of Drum magazine. Drum magazine was published in Johannesburg, South Africa. Drum magazine introduced me to black South Africans. That Drum magazine story was titled Super Brain of Africa. The heart of those articles written about Philip Emeagwali was that I discovered the supercomputer hopefuls' most well-guarded secret, namely how to parallel process and how to use to solve grand challenge problems across a new internet that is defined and outlined by millions upon millions of commodity off-the-shelf processors. Yet, the paradigm shift for the field of supercomputing isn't recording the fastest calculations. The heart of supercomputing is solving the grand challenge problems of computer science. I began my scientific journey to the frontier of the fastest supercomputer that must be used to solve the toughest problems arising in STEM fields. I began my technological journey with the slowest analog computer called a slide rule that I purchased in June 1970 in Onitsha, Nigeria. I began that journey as a tiny entry of the name Philip Emeagwali in the Daily Times of Nigeria of mid-1972. I bought my first analog computer for the price of £1 Nigerian. That was 1 month's wage back in 1970. I bought that manual computer from a bookstore that was near Zix Roundabout and that was near Dennis Memorial Grammar School, Onitsha, East Central State, Nigeria. 3 years after I purchased my manual computer, I received a scholarship letter from Oregon, United States, that was dated September 10, 1973. For 5 centuries, my ancestors were born in Onitsha, Nigeria. In about 1905, my great-grandfather, whose first name was Emeagwali, was relocated from his ancestral homeland that is the present location of General Hospital, Onitsha, Nigeria. I know the names of my ancestors up to the year 1562, when the first slaves were captured by John Hawkins. John Hawkins was England's first slave trader. John Hawkins brought the first slaves from the Gulf of Guinea of the Atlantic Ocean to the West Indies. My Igbo-speaking ancestors were farmers and hunters. My grandparents could not read. The fathers, my paternal grandfather traveled from his mud-thatched home at 17 Mba Road, Onitsha, at the east bank of the River Niger, was to visit his maternal cousins who were living on the west bank of the River Niger at Asaba. The farthest my maternal grandfather traveled from his birthplace at 6 Wilkinson Road, Onitsha, was to visit his maternal cousins in the village of Obosi that was just a 2-mile walk. I'm from Anambra State of Nigeria. Anambra State adopted the motto, "The light of the nation." In mid-19th century Nigeria, elders shared their knowledge and wisdom in informal settings such as oral literature in the form of moonlight stories. There were no primary schools in Igbo land up to a century before I was born. The first primary school in Nigeria was established in 1843 in Badagry, Lagos. Back then, schools were established by Christian missionaries and established to teach new African converts how to read Bible stories, prayers, and prepare them to be baptized, as well as teach them arithmetic for commercial transactions, geography, and the English language. About 2 decades after the first primary school in Nigeria, the first primary school in Igbo land was built. That first school was located in my ancestral hometown of Onitsha, Nigeria. That first school was located a short walking distance from the household of my paternal great-grandfather that was then in the late 1850s at the present-day location of General Hospital, Onitsha. My ancestors are from the Igbo tribe of southeastern Nigeria. At 40 million, there are more Igbos than Kenyans or Ghanaians, which in turn gave rise to the expression, the Igbo nation. As a nation, Ndi Igbo will be about the 10th most populous in Africa. My ancestral hometown, Onitsha, is to Igbo land what London is to England. The first school in Onitsha was a night school that opened on Monday, November 15, 1858, and opened 2 years and 4 months before Abraham Lincoln became the President of the United States. The first students at that first school were young female slaves who were ridiculed by the community. In the mid-19th century, my forefathers preferred hands-on agricultural education to classroom education. In the year 1864, the total school enrollment in Igbo land comprised of 70 night students and 50 day students, and all those 120 students were in Onitsha, a town of about 20,000 persons. The first school in Onitsha was apparently built under the supervision of Reverend John Taylor, a Sierra Leonean of Igbo ancestry, who in turn reported to Bishop Ajayi Crowther, a freed slave of Yoruba ancestry, that is the subject of school reports in Nigeria. That first primary school of mid-19th century was where Ndi Igbo learned the times table of arithmetic. The first secondary school in Igbo land is named Dennis Memorial Grammar School, or DMGS, Onitsha. That first high school was founded on the 25th of January 1925. DMGS was located a short walk from the household of my grandfather at 17 Mba Road, Onitsha. The first times algebra, physics, and eventually introductory calculus were introduced in Igbo land was most likely in Onitsha at either Christ the King College, Onitsha, that was founded on February 2, 1933, or in Dennis Memorial Grammar School that was founded on January 25, 1925. When my father was born back in May 1921 at 17 Mba Road, Onitsha, there was no secondary school in Igbo land, a region that is now the ancestral land of 40 million persons. And when my father graduated from Christ the King College, Onitsha, Nigeria, back in 1947, there was no university in Nigeria. Because the first schools in Igbo land were in my ancestral hometown of Onitsha, it should not come as a surprise that a high concentration of Nigeria's leading intellectuals were born in and around Onitsha, Anambra State, especially in Onitsha inland town called Enu Onitsha. Names of persons born in and around Onitsha who made contributions to human knowledge include Olaudah Equiano, who is credited by African American historians as the father of black literature; Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was Nigeria's foremost public intellectual of the 1940s and 50s; Chinua Achebe, who is Africa's foremost novelist; and Ben Enwangu, who is Nigeria's most influential artist.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.